A few years ago, I made a video titled Kyle Kalinske Doesn't Get Russia, where I debunked the idea that the United States had somehow promised Russia that NATO would not expand past Germany. In the beginning of that video, I mentioned the Blame America First crowd, and how Kyle was part of it. The defining feature of Blame America First isn't that they hate America, though many of them do, or even that they criticize America. The United States, and I say this as a patriot, has done things that are worthy of criticism. Even though a lot of these criticisms are unfair or unwarranted in my opinion, the United States certainly isn't perfect. No, the defining feature of Blame America First is that if there's a problem internationally, the Blame America First crowd just reflexively assumes that it's America's fault. Let's revisit that Russian issue real quick. In a live stream that Kyle did several months ago, he was asked about former Soviet states. Here was his answer.
The Soviet Union was dissolved, and so then you had all these countries that were formerly part of the Soviet Union that are now independent countries. Do I think those countries should remain free? Of course. It's whatever they want. If they want to remain free, they should remain free. If they want to become part of what is modern-day Russia, they should be able to become part of modern-day Russia. So that's my position on that. But, I feel like NATO is a problem because it keeps creeping closer and closer to Russia's border, even though originally they promised they wouldn't do that. And so, I just feel like oftentimes in the West, we immediately blame Russia and we view everything they do as by definition offensive and everything we do as by definition defensive. And I don't agree with that. I think you have to look at everything on a case-by-case basis. And in the case of Russia, we have been aggressive in making NATO creep closer and closer to Russia's borders.
Sounds pretty reasonable, doesn't it? These nations should be allowed to decide their own future. Who wouldn't want that? Certainly not me. That's one of the reasons I'm glad so many of them joined NATO. They wanted to, and it protects their sovereignty. Every nation that's in NATO applied to be in NATO. And NATO is only supposed to comprise democracies. Though the fact that Turkey is still in the alliance definitely undermines that. So many former Soviet republics joined NATO precisely because they wanted to keep their popular sovereignty, as opposed to becoming vassal states of Russia like so many of their neighbors. Kyle says he wants these nations to decide their future, but he doesn't mention as a possible future being part of NATO because he just assumes that no nation would ever be in league with America on its own terms. If these nations join in an alliance with America, it must be the result of some cynical plan by the United States itself. Now, lest you think Kyle didn't mention joining NATO as a possible future for former Soviet republics, but is fundamentally okay with it, he's not. He's on record as opposing the expansion of NATO, and blames this for Vladimir Putin's expansionism.
To say that removing troops from removing NATO troops from Russia's border is a bad thing, how little do you know? Seriously, how little do you know about the world? Because, there was a deal between Russia and the US. Okay, there's the collapse of the Soviet Union, but it's okay. We got NATO, but we're not going to go an inch closer to Russia's border because that would be provocation now, wouldn't it? And then over the years, they inch closer, and they inch closer, and they inch closer. And Russia thinks, oh my God, this is a provocation, and they're coming for us. NATO's coming for us. They promised they wouldn't move closer to our border. They're moving closer to our border. So this is an offensive act on the part of NATO. Now, in response, one of the things Vladimir Putin did was jack Crimea.
This necessarily means that Kyle thinks that Russia should have a de facto veto over what its neighbors do. Several weeks ago, Kyle released a video where he made a rather sloppy analogy to World War I that his own audience called him out on. In this video, he makes very clear that he's against international alliances per se.
So the takeaway from World War I is, maybe we shouldn't have strategic alliances with all these other independent nations, because if there happens to be something that happens in one of them, then we get drawn in, then somebody else gets drawn in, then somebody else gets drawn in, and next thing you know, the entire world is at war. Whereas if it was more of like a go-it-alone attempt, a go-it-alone approach, then you would have had a much more compartmentalized and fragmented war on a much smaller scale, which would have been significantly less bloody. So the lesson of World War I was actually non-interventionism is better. Or, the pejorative term people use is isolationism is better.
So he's perfectly fine with smaller nations being left on their own against their larger, expansionist neighbors, because he thinks that the alternative is more likely to bring America into a larger conflict. I've previously argued that such agreements are far more likely to prevent war, as long as any would-be attackers know that larger nations will live up to their mutual defense obligations. But that's another topic to revisit on another day. Right now, I want to point out that Blame America First is neither necessarily nor exclusively a left-wing thing. One of the more recent episodes of Blame America First happened in the context of Cuban protests that happened earlier this year. Why were the Cuban people protesting? Presumably because they're tired of living in poverty. Why do Cubans live in poverty? Well, that's easy. It's America's fault.
But it is incredibly dishonest to talk about what's happening in Cuba without bringing up the U.S. embargo. We have 240 sanctions on that country. The protests were very clear. There's a shortage of food. There's a shortage of medical supplies. They want more food. They want more medical supplies. If the U.S. lifts the embargo, that would instantly help the people of Cuba. It's not an opinion. That's a fact.
Again, simply being critical of the American embargo on Cuba, pointing out its flaws and its negative consequences, or criticizing American foreign policy more generally, does not mean that one blames America first. That's not the problem here. I'm opposed to the embargo. I recognize that it has hurt the Cuban people. I want American commerce with Cuba because I believe that, like Vietnam, it will help foster a good relationship between the nations and help push Cuba in a more capitalistic and democratic direction. No, the issue is not that these people oppose the embargo. It's that these exact same people who oppose the embargo will turn around and say this about American trade with other nations.
The other thing is, stop with the disastrous trade deals. Now listen, to be fair, I don't know how much the Guatemala situation is related to a trade deal because I don't know the specifics of the U.S. trade situation with Guatemala. So I don't know if that one pertains to this specific country, but in general, yes, if we stop the disastrous trade deals, then people wouldn't be fleeing from economically dilapidated places.
So, for those of you keeping track at home, trading with America causes poverty and exploitation, and not trading with America causes poverty and exploitation. It's almost as if these people see a problem that exists in another part of the world and look for a way to blame it on America. That's what I mean when I accuse these people of blaming America first. Now, I want to end this video by briefly talking about how, even though the embargo has contributed to Cuba's poverty, it is by no means the most important variable. Another reason some of these socialists blame the embargo for Cuba's situation is that they don't want to concede that a planned economy could fail so disastrously. Luckily, we have a real-life example we can compare Cuba to. Taiwan is also a small island nation that is located off the coast of a much larger, more powerful nation that is hostile to it. As is always the case with nations, the comparison is not perfect. Unlike Cuba, Taiwan is not considered a resource-rich nation. According to worldatlas.com, Taiwan does not have a wide range of natural resources like some other Asian countries. Some of its major natural resources include gold, copper, coal, petroleum, natural gas, marble, and river. I think river is a bit of an odd classification, but there it is. According to the same website, Cuba has plenty of natural resources such as nickel, cobalt, petroleum, arable land, forests, incredible landscapes, and rich biodiversity. Cuba has put that arable land to use, as its largest crops are sugar and tobacco. That said, it hardly exports any of these products, and that's not because of the embargo. The embargo only prevents some American firms from trading with Cuba. The United States still has hundreds of millions of dollars worth of trade with the island nation, most of which is foodstuffs. No, Cuba hardly exports any sugar because their farms are so inefficient. In fact, they hardly produce enough sugar for their own consumption. Cuba is just over 42,000 square miles in area, roughly the size of the state of Tennessee, and has a population of 11.33 million as of 2020. Taiwan is considerably smaller at just under 14,000 square miles. That is roughly the size of Maryland, but has a much larger population at just over 23.5 million. In terms of economic output, they aren't even close. Taiwan has a GDP of $668.5 billion. That's over $33,000 per capita, putting Taiwan at 29th in the entire world. Cuba has a GDP of $103 billion. That's just over $9,000 per person, putting Cuba's economy at 76th in the entire world. Taiwan has the lowest poverty rate in all of Asia at 1.3%. Good numbers on the same metric in Cuba are hard to find, but every single estimate shows the poverty rate to be considerably higher. And while Cuba cannot even produce enough sugar for its own people, Taiwan has an export-based economy. economy. It is one of the world's largest exporters of electronics and semiconductors. So what accounts for the difference in economic performance? Why is it that, despite having fewer natural resources, and also living in the shadow of a much larger country that has politically marginalized it, the people of Taiwan have much higher standards of living than those of Cuba? The main difference is because of the economic systems each nation has respectively embraced. In the 1970s, Cuba and Taiwan had similar sized economies, and the biggest industry in both nations was agriculture. The people of Taiwan, having witnessed the disaster of planned economics in the People's Republic of China, started to embrace market reforms, encouraged private investment, and gradually replaced their authoritarian governing structures with more democratic institutions. Along with its neighbors South Korea, Singapore, and Hong Kong, all of whom made similar reforms, Taiwan experienced massive growth and industrialization. These nations became known as the Asian Tigers for their robust economic performance. This period for these nations between the 1960s and the 1990s became known as the Asian Miracle. Are these nations the perfect embodiment of free market capitalism? No, no country on earth is. But they've done pretty well for themselves in that respect. Taiwan is the 6th freest economy in the world according to the Heritage Foundation's Index of Economic Freedom, while South Korea is number 24, and Singapore is actually number 1. Hong Kong used to consistently top the list, but is now sadly ranked as a part of China, which is 107th. Hopefully, Taiwan does not eventually become absorbed into China as well. In an article published by the Taiwanese embassy in Mexico, government officials stated that Taiwan, despite having started as a one-party military dictatorship, in the 1990s began a process of democratization that today has it as one of the freest countries in the world, with high rates of press freedom, health service, public education, economic freedom, and human development. That is why Communist China sees Taiwan and its international recognition as an existential threat. The contrast is stark. Democracy has not only proven that it can work, but has brought multiple benefits to the population. Taiwanese have a better quality of life and opportunities for personal development than the average Chinese on the mainland. And all this within a framework of freedoms that are unthinkable in a communist China that censures dissidents and whole ruling party increasingly tightens its control over all aspects of the country. Again, Taiwan is not some libertarian paradise. Its government does offer efficient, well-run basic services. But make no mistake, free enterprise was instrumental in the rise of Taiwan's economy. In fact, Taiwan's economy began to boom well before most democratic reforms were implemented. Cuba, on the other hand, has continued to stagnate. They've consistently relied on support from outside nations to support their already impoverished population. The Soviet Union was their biggest benefactor. In 1985, the USSR accounted for 70% of the trade with Cuba. This all stopped in 1991 when the Soviet Union cut off all aid to Cuba, and by the end of that year, ceased to exist as a political entity. The main reason was the Soviet Union could no longer financially support its empire. Much like their Cuban benefactors, the Soviet Union's planned economy simply wasn't producing enough resources to draw upon. This was devastating for the Cuban people, but the USSR simply couldn't afford to do it anymore. It's almost as if planned economies consistently lag behind their capitalist counterparts.